"You were not even worth raising," Jenna said loud enough for every fork in the room to stop. Her voice floated above the Christmas lights and over the heads of both families, and for a second I thought the world had tilted because no one reacted. Not one person. My son Michael stared at his plate the way a child stares at a broken toy hoping someone else will fix it. His father-in-law let out a short, awkward laugh, as if the insult needed a cheer track. Jenna even reached for her wine with a satisfied smile like she had just performed a public service. I felt my hand tremble around my water glass. I told myself to keep it steady. I told myself not to be weak in front of a woman who enjoyed watching my face crumble. But the real betrayal was not her words. It was the silence. The heavy, suffocating silence of people who decided I deserved it. Then Jenna did something I will remember until the day I die. She slid my plate away from me with one finger and said in the same bright voice you use with a toddler who spills juice, "You said you were tight on money this month. Nora, maybe save this for someone who actually invested in their kids." She did not whisper. She wanted the room to hear, and they did. The worst part was Lily and Evan, my grandchildren. They tried to run to me, but Jenna blocked them with her arm and said, "Not now. Hands are dirty. Adults are talking. Adults." As if I were not one. As if I were some visitor who had wandered in from the cold asking for scraps. My throat burned, but I kept my face straight. Rage and humiliation pulsed so hot my skin prickled. What stung the most was Michael, my only child, the boy I worked 3 jobs for, the man I taught to tie his shoes. He kept his head down and shoveled potatoes onto a plate for Evan like he was deaf, like he had never once clung to my leg, crying not to leave him on his first day of school. I swallowed hard. The Nora they thought they knew would have apologized and made herself small. But the truth is, the person at that table was a stranger to them, because the real me was someone they had never bothered to ask about. A few hours earlier, my morning had begun with a message that Jenna would never believe belonged to a woman she called useless, a reminder from the board chair of Midwest Learning Futures Foundation asking me to be ready for the 9:00 confirmation call for the $18 million allocation. I had silenced the phone and slipped it into my coat pocket before leaving for dinner. I had spent my career as a quiet keeper of numbers for the school district while secretly managing grants and budgets Jenna could not dream of, but none of them at that table cared to know that. They preferred the simple story. Old widow, small pension. Lucky to be invited. The truth lived in folders locked in a fireproof box in my apartment. Truth written on deeds and account statements and trust documents. Truth Jenna had never imagined because she had never bothered to imagine me as anything more than a convenience. Something about the word worth snapped something inside me. I stood slowly. Every eye flicked toward me except Michael. Jenna raised an eyebrow like she expected me to thank her for the lesson. Instead, I placed my napkin gently on the table. My voice came out steady. Too steady. "Thank you for the reminder, Jenna." I touched Lily's shoulder as I passed and squeezed Michael's hand for half a second. He froze like a man afraid to move. I walked out without another word. No one stopped me. I stepped into the cold December night and felt something inside me settle into place. Not anger, not sadness, clarity. When I got home, I hung up my coat and walked straight to the bedroom closet. I pulled out the steel box from the top shelf. My hands no longer shook. Inside the box sat the papers that held the real story of my life. The estate worth $2.4 million. The trust that owned the house Michael and Jenna lived in. The investment accounts I had built over 3 decades. And my role as treasurer of a foundation that ran on decisions I helped sign. They thought I was a burden. They thought I needed charity. They thought humiliation would keep me in line. They were wrong. I sat at my kitchen table under the yellow light and spread the papers in front of me. Quiet, precise, and cold. By sunrise, Jenna Sullivan would learn 2 things: exactly how much I was worth, and whose name truly rested on the estate her perfect life depended on. I drove home after that dinner with Jenna's words still echoing in my head, and as I stepped into my quiet apartment, the silence wrapped around me the way it had so many nights before, and I found myself drifting back to the beginning of everything, to the first place where the feeling of being worth less than others had been planted long before Jenna ever existed in my life. Because the truth is, humiliation at 63 feels familiar, only because humiliation at 6 was the same shape, just smaller and sharper, and carried by a deeper voice. I grew up in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment on the east side of Cleveland, where winters came early and left late, and where my father believed girls were decorative at best and disposable at worst. And I still remember the way he used to lean back in his worn brown chair, telling my mother not to waste money on me, repeating, "She is just a girl. Do not throw resources into something that will never pay you back." And each time he said it, another thin crack opened inside me, a quiet fracture that a child cannot name but always remembers. My mother tried to soften those blows by smoothing my hair or handing me small tasks that made me feel useful, but she was trapped in her own circle of quiet obedience and survival, and the house always felt heavy with unsaid things. So I learned early that in some homes, silence is not peace, but pressure. And in some families, love is measured in money, withheld, and opportunities denied. And even though I was just a girl, I made myself a promise one night while listening to them argue in the kitchen that if no one else saw value in me, I would learn to create my own value without asking for permission. Numbers became the one place where no one could tell me I did not belong, and I excelled, because numbers never mocked you, never dismissed you, and never told you to stay small. And by the time I was 18, I had become the kind of student who could balance a ledger faster than I could braid my own hair. I put myself through community college with scholarships and side jobs, and after graduating, I took a position as an entry-level accountant for the Cleveland School District, thinking it would be temporary, but 28 years passed before I even realized how much responsibility I had collected piece by piece, and how deeply I understood the system, not the glossy parts shown on brochures, but the real machinery, the payroll patterns, the budget gaps, the quiet emergencies that teachers never voiced publicly, but brought to me in whispered conversations after staff meetings. I fought for every dollar that kept classrooms running because I knew too well what it meant to grow up with not enough. And somewhere in those years, I became more than the woman who filed reports. I became the person who kept the lights on when the district wavered and the person who confronted department heads when they tried to cut essential programs under the guise of restructuring. And I learned that being underestimated was a powerful advantage, because people tend to reveal their true motives when they think you are harmless. The real turning point came in my 15th year when the district faced a scandal involving misused activity funds at a middle school. And while everyone whispered and panicked, I did what I had always done. I followed the paper trail quietly and precisely through receipts that did not match dates and contracts that were signed too quickly and invoices that made no sense, and I documented everything with the care of someone who understood the stakes. When the investigation unfolded, the superintendent thanked half a dozen people for their diligence, without naming me once, but the board members noticed. And in under 3 months, I was invited to join a small advisory panel for a nonprofit that provided grants to underfunded schools. That panel later evolved into the Midwest Learning Futures Foundation, and over time I became its treasurer, managing the allocation of $18 to $20 million annually in scholarships and infrastructure grants. I sat in rooms with legislators and donors and educators who had no idea the small, quiet accountant from Cleveland had grown into someone whose signature could redirect the entire future of a school district, and I preferred it that way because anonymity is its own kind of power. It meant I could make decisions without my family feeling entitled to question them, and honestly, they never asked about my work in any real way. Michael would occasionally say, "How is the paperwork stuff going, Mom?" without ever asking what paperwork meant. And Jenna once told a friend I overheard that I was basically a retired bookkeeper who filled time with volunteer accounting for charity, which amused me so much I had to step into the bathroom to keep from laughing out loud, because the truth is, the house they live in stands partly because of grants. I arranged long before they applied for the mortgage, and the school their children attend received technology, upgrades approved in a budget review. I led 2 years ago. Looking back, my own childhood was a quiet, toxic family class, and I learned early that money, silence, and control are always part of a hidden family betrayal, and that the person who understands the numbers understands the choices and the consequences. My family never imagined I held that kind of responsibility because they never imagined me as someone who could hold anything substantial. And it suited me to let them see only the edges of my life. The grocery trips, the babysitting, the modest apartment, all carefully chosen parts of a mask that protected me from the expectation that I should share everything I built just because we share blood. Sitting at my kitchen table remembering those early years in Cleveland, with the smell of stale radiator heat and my mother's tired hands smoothing my hair, I felt a strange calm fill me, because I realized that Jenna was not the first person to try to define my worth, and she would not be the last, but unlike my 6-year-old self, I no longer had to swallow the words and keep living small. I knew what I had built. I knew the systems I sustained, and I knew the estate they assumed did not exist, and for the first time in a long time, I felt the quiet, solid weight of my own power settling back into my bones. Not the flashy kind Jenna loves to display, but the steady kind that shapes futures and ends games before others realize the game has begun. The memory of that Christmas humiliation still clung to me the next morning as I made my coffee, slowly stirring the cream while the house remained quiet around me, and I found myself thinking not just about the explosion the night before, but the long, slow erosion that had led to it, because cruelty rarely arrives. Suddenly, it usually comes drip by drip, disguised as jokes, or casual comments, or little corrections meant to remind you of where they believe you belong, and Jenna excelled at that kind of slow-cutting dismissal, the sort that does not leave bruises but leaves marks all the same. It had begun years earlier in the small ways people use when they feel safe towering over someone they think cannot push back. And I remember the first time she called me our built-in babysitter while holding Lily in her arms and laughing with her friends, as if it were charming for a grown woman to be labeled furniture. And I had smiled politely because what else do you do in front of company? But inside the words stung. Not because I minded helping with my grandchildren, but because she said it like I was a household appliance that had come with the mortgage. Over time, she added more lines to her private script of superiority, saying things like, "You are lucky you get to just exist," while some of us actually work as if my 30 years of grinding through district budgets and fixing other people's messes counted for nothing, and each time she glanced at my clothes or my hands or my aging face, she seemed to take pleasure in reminding me that she thought I had nothing to offer except time and silence. Whenever I brought small things for the kids, new shoes on sale, art supplies from a teacher store, a winter coat for Lily, because Ohio winters show no mercy, she would deliver the same line with practiced sweetness. "You really should not spend from your tiny pension. Nora, you should save it for bingo." And every time she said tiny pension, the words curled like smoke around the table, a thin insult she wanted me to inhale without reacting. One afternoon during a family lunch, her father, a man with the charm of a faded salesman and the tact of someone who had never been told no, made a comment that still burns. When I recall it, he lifted his glass and said, "At least Jenna married up an ambition," because in his mind, Daniel, the man I lost far too early, had been small, and so by extension so was I, and I felt my spine tighten, while Michael fidgeted with his napkin, refusing again to meet my eyes. These moments did not come with shouting or violence. They came as small dismissals that accumulate until your own home feels unfamiliar, and your own place in your family feels conditional. And even though I had built a life that was far larger than the story they told themselves about me, I allowed the comments to pass because I did not want Michael to feel caught between two women he loved. But a person can endure only so many cuts before she begins to stitch her boundaries back together. And months before the Christmas disaster, I had already started reclaiming the parts of my dignity they tried to wear down, and it began with something simple, something ordinary, something Jenna never expected: the bills. When Michael and Jenna bought their house, they struggled with the first round of utility setup, and I offered to help by setting the first electric bill on auto pay just to make sure nothing was shut off while they were settling in, and they accepted, gladly assuming I was simply being useful. And I said nothing because helping quietly was second nature to me, and I did not need applause. But after yet another afternoon when Jenna waved off my offer to pick up Lily from school, saying we do not really need old help, and after hearing her brag to her friend that her life would be perfect if she did not have to manage a dependent mother-in-law, I felt something shift inside me, the same shift I had felt as a child when my father insisted girls were not worth investment. Only this time I was not a powerless girl, and I had no interest in being the easy target she believed I was. So one evening, while drinking tea at my kitchen table, I logged into my bank account and I quietly removed the auto pay for their gas, their internet, and their streaming services, all innocuous little threads that had made their life smoother threads they never acknowledged I had woven for them. And I did it not out of malice, but out of precision, a soft boundary drawn with a steady hand. A month later, the effects appeared like clockwork. Netflix cut off halfway through a show Jenna adored, and within minutes my phone vibrated with her angry text asking if my card had expired, because somehow the bills had bounced. The next day Michael called, sounding flustered, saying the gas company had sent a notice and asking if something was wrong with my account. And I smiled, a quiet, tired smile. The kind you smile when you have regained a small piece of yourself. I answered calmly, saying your card must have expired. The bills bounced, and then added, "Oh, I assumed you did not want my tiny pension paying for your big life anymore." And I could almost hear the silence on the other end of the line the moment it dawned on them that the conveniences they took for granted were not gifts from the universe, but from me. It was petty perhaps, but it was also grounding a small reclaiming of dignity in a world where Jenna believed she could strip it away without consequence. And what she did not know was that I was just getting started, because the deeper I looked, the more I realized that her sense of entitlement did not grow from thin air. It grew from opportunity. And some of that opportunity had come from me without my knowledge. One rainy afternoon, I was reviewing my credit report, which I check regularly as habit from my district years, and I noticed a soft inquiry from a department store card. I had never applied for the contact. Email was unfamiliar, but the listed home address was unmistakably mine, and that detail sent a cold clarity through my chest because it took only a few clicks and one quiet call to confirm that months earlier, someone had attempted to use my identity to open a retail account. And though the application was never completed, the digital fingerprints matched the exact device that Jenna used for her online shopping, the same device she bragged about finding discount codes on. It was a small attempt, perhaps abandoned quickly, but it revealed something about her that I had not fully seen. Before, she had already viewed me as a resource to extract, not just emotionally and socially, but financially. And in that moment, I understood the depth of her entitlement. It was not enough for her to mock my worth. She believed she had a right to access the parts of my life she assumed were unguarded, and the realization sent a slow wave of anger through me. Not loud, volcanic anger, but cold, precise anger, the kind that builds foundations under decisions and whispers, "This will not continue." As I closed my laptop that night, the room dim except for the soft glow of the table lamp, I felt something settle inside me again, a certainty that the woman they believed was small was only small because they had never bothered to look closely. And slowly I began to understand that every little cut, every careless dismissal, every smirking comment was preparing me for something larger, something I had not yet named but felt gathering like a storm behind my ribs, and I knew that when the storm broke, it would not be loud, it would be deliberate, and it would be final. The day of Lily's 10th birthday arrived with the thin spring sunlight of April drifting through the windows of Michael and Jenna's house. And I remember holding the cake I had baked the night before with careful hands, because baking had always been the one place where I felt steady and useful, even when people tried to make me feel small. And I walked up the driveway hearing the noise of children running in the backyard, the laughter of parents, the clinking of cups, and I tried to quiet the nervous hum inside my chest, knowing how Jenna tended to perform when she had an audience, and how easily she slipped into a version of herself that sharpened whenever she looked at me. And as I stepped inside the crowded living room, the smell of frosting and pizza mixing together, Jenna turned her head just enough to see the cake in my hands, and her smile tightened in that familiar way, before she said loudly, "We already ordered from a real bakery. But sure, we can put yours out too." And the way she stretched the word real made a few of her friends glance at each other while Michael pretended to fuss with the stack of paper plates. I placed the cake gently on the counter, deciding not to let my face betray anything, because the moment I reacted, she would act innocent and accuse me of being too sensitive. And I made my way toward the backyard where the kids were playing under the string lights Jenna had hung earlier, and Lily ran to hug me, leaving a streak of green frosting on my sweater, and for a brief moment everything felt right, until Jenna called out, "Lily, careful. Your grandmother's clothes are not exactly washable in a tone that sliced through the easy warmth of the moment," and Lily pulled back, confused, while I reassured her softly. As the adults moved toward the patio for the birthday song, Jenna began one of her dramatic speeches about how hard she had worked to make the day perfect and how exhausting motherhood was when no one ever helped. And I stood behind a group of parents listening quietly while she waved her hands as if performing on stage. And then she looked directly at me, the way someone tests a blade before cutting, and said, "Some mothers just did not do the work." Honestly, some people are not even worth raising. And for a moment, time felt suspended. The balloons swayed in the breeze. The kids fell silent without knowing why, and the adults shifted uncomfortably, pretending to focus on the gift table, while Michael stood beside Jenna, staring down at the deck boards as if he could disappear into them. Her parents looked away, pretending they had not heard anything, although they clearly had. And in the far corner of the yard, I spotted a familiar face standing near the hydrangea bushes, Elaine Porter, my former colleague from the school district, someone who had shared late nights balancing district ledgers with me, someone who knew exactly what I had done for decades, and she was watching everything, her eyes narrowing with each word Jenna said. The humiliation pressed into my chest like a physical weight, not because the words were new, but because she chose this moment, this celebration, this group of people to make her cruelty a spectacle. And even though the children did not understand the full meaning, I could see in their hesitant glances that they sensed the wrongness, the rupture in the air. And again, Michael said nothing, not a word, not even a gentle correction or a change of subject, and that silence cut deeper than anything Jenna had said, because it told me that he had grown used to her disrespect, maybe even accepted it as normal. When the candles were finally lit, Lily made her wish and blew them out while the adults applauded too loudly, trying to paper over the tension, and I stepped back, letting the children crowd around the table and pretending to check my phone so no one would see the tightness in my jaw. After the guests began drifting inside for cake, Jenna gathered a few of her mom friends and bragged about her plan to join the school's parent board, saying she wanted to become the face of the school's charity efforts. And I almost laughed at the irony, because the school relied heavily on grants from the foundation where I was treasurer, and her obliviousness was so absolute that she had not even considered who held the pen that approved those funds. I did not say a word that day, but a few weeks later, during a foundation meeting when the school principal praised several parents who were being considered for leadership roles, I leaned forward and asked in a calm, steady voice, "Is the parent who publicly belittles grandparents also being considered for representing our school in family engagement?" I phrased it evenly without naming Jenna, yet the description landed sharply, and the principal blinked in confusion before nodding slowly and making a note, while the counselor beside her exchanged a look that told me they understood there was more to the story. It was a small, darkly funny revenge in its own way, not cruel, but clarifying a subtle reminder that actions have consequences in rooms where reputations matter. And over the next few days, I noticed the school staff began observing Jenna more closely, asking questions about parent interactions and being far less eager to pull her into leadership conversations. That birthday party had been a turning point, not only for me, but for someone else too, because later that evening, after I had returned home and changed into comfortable clothes and tried to settle my emotions with a cup of chamomile tea, my phone rang, and when I saw Elaine's name on the screen, I felt a mixture of surprise and something like relief. She did not waste time on small talk, instead saying, "I had no idea it was this bad, Nora," and her voice carried the kind of quiet outrage only someone who truly respects you can feel. And she added, "You know, you are not just some retired nobody, right?" If they knew who they were talking to, and the words were simple, but held a weight, because she was the first witness in years who had seen the full picture, the first person who recognized what Jenna was doing, and understood the absurdity of treating me like someone insignificant. I thanked her gently, not wanting to let my voice shake, and after the call, I sat on my couch, letting the silence settle around me, and for the first time, I realized that someone outside the family finally saw the truth, not just about Jenna, but about me and the life I had lived, quietly, the decades of responsibility, the financial expertise, the decisions that had shaped entire programs and budgets and futures for students who would never know my name. And that realization did not erase the hurt of that day, but it planted something sturdier in its place, a kind of steadiness, a confirmation that I was not imagining the cruelty, and that someone reliable had witnessed the moment Jenna crossed a line so deeply that it could never be blurred again, and that witness would matter more than I knew. Because when the time came to reveal the truth of who I was and what I controlled, there would be a voice beyond mine, a voice that had seen everything and understood exactly how far Jenna had gone. When I got back to my apartment after the birthday party, the door clicked shut behind me, with a sound that felt too final and too familiar, and I walked slowly into the dim living room, dropping my purse onto the small table by the entryway, before lowering myself into the armchair that had molded to my shape over years of late nights and quiet mornings. And as I sat there, the humiliation of the day settled on my shoulders like a heavy blanket, because it was not just the words "some people are not even worth raising," it was the way they all accepted it, the ease with which they allowed me to be diminished, as if I were an optional character in the life I had helped build. And as I stared at the blank wall, I felt myself slip back into the childhood version of me, the girl who had heard her father dismiss her dreams by telling her she is just a girl and does not need more than the basics, and the girl who had learned early that being overlooked could become a pattern if you did not carve out your own worth quietly and relentlessly. For a few minutes, I let myself sink into that old ache, the raw knot just beneath the ribs that comes from generations of being undervalued. And I wondered how I had allowed myself to fall back into the same emotional position decades later, how I had let a grown woman who had never built anything on her own decide my worth in front of a room full of people. And there was a moment so sharp it made my breath tremble, when I almost believed the version of me that Jenna tried to paint, the harmless retired woman with a tiny pension and nothing left to offer the world but spare time and quiet obedience. But then something steadier rose from beneath the hurt, a memory of who I truly was and what I had carried alone all these years. And I pushed myself up from the chair, walking toward the bedroom with a slow, deliberate certainty that came from the part of me that had survived far worse dismissals than a spoiled daughter-in-law's cruelty, and I knelt beside the bed, reaching under it for the small fireproof safe where I kept every document that truly told my story. The weight of the safe in my hands grounded me, reminding me of the life I had built far away from their assumptions, and I set it on the bed, entering the code with fingers that no longer trembled. And when the lock clicked open, a different air filled the room, the quiet authority of a life no one in that family had ever bothered to understand. Inside the safe lay the truth of my existence, neat and organized in folders and envelopes, the way only someone trained in financial order could maintain. And as I lifted the documents one by one, I felt the years of invisibility peel away. The first folder held the deed to the house where Michael and Jenna lived, a comfortable 4-bedroom home with a market value around $650,000, legally held in the Blake Living Trust, with me as the trustee. And although I had gifted them the right to live there, I had never transferred the deed, something they never asked about because they assumed ownership simply because they occupied it. Beneath that deed was the paperwork for my own apartment, fully paid off, a $230,000 space I had chosen for simplicity and peace. Then another deed for the small condo I rented out to a teacher friend, a property worth around $220,000 purchased decades ago, when the market had dipped, and I had known exactly which long-term investments create stability. The investment folder came next, thicker, heavier, filled with printouts of index fund balances, a carefully structured bond ladder, and statements from my old 403B account, totaling roughly $1.1 million, built not from luck, but from decades of diligent planning and the kind of financial literacy Jenna could not define even if someone spelled it out for her. Under those sat my cash reserves, certificates of deposit, and emergency funds, amounting to another $200,000 to $250,000, held intentionally liquid because stability is power and preparedness is dignity. The final folder contained documents from the foundation that rested at the center of my professional legacy, the Midwest Learning Futures Foundation, an $18 million educational fund where I had served quietly as treasurer for years, shaping grants that supported countless students and programs across the district, and tucked into the folder was a photograph of me accepting an award that read, "For Outstanding Service in Education Finance." Something I had never shown Michael because he never asked, and something Jenna would not believe, even if she saw it with her own eyes. As I looked at the spread of documents across the bed, the truth sharpened inside me. They see a woman with a tiny pension. They never bothered to ask who signs off on grants that keep half this district running, and the idea carried no bitterness, only clarity, the kind that forms right before a storm breaks. I gathered the papers, neatly returning each folder to its place before closing the safe and sliding it back beneath the bed. Then I sat on the edge for a long moment, letting the weight of my hidden world settle into a new shape inside me. Not shame, not secrecy, but readiness. And I understood that the humiliation they thought would silence me had instead pulled back the curtain on what I needed to do next. The first action I took was small but surgical. I reviewed every account where my money touched their lives. The gym membership Jenna loved because it made her feel superior, the summer camp for the kids that charged automatically each year, the subscriptions and conveniences she used while complaining about my so-called small life. And one by one, I ended them without announcement, without commentary, striking each expense from my records like cleaning dust from a shelf. I imagined the moment Jenna would receive the emails stating, "Payment declined," or "Your membership is canceled," and the slow dawning confusion followed by frustration because she had mistaken generosity for obligation. And when the call inevitably came, her voice sharp with annoyance, starting with "Your card must have," and I cut her off, gently saying, "I thought you did not want my worthless raising to support your lifestyle anymore. Consider it aligned with your values," and the silence that followed was a precise, satisfying thing. Ending those small financial supports was not revenge. Exactly, it was correction, a withdrawal of access from someone who had never appreciated the privilege. And although she could not see it, the real shift was happening beneath the surface, where I had begun to rebuild the boundaries she spent years trying to erode. But the larger step required more than quiet taps on a keyboard. It required expertise I had kept dormant, and the willingness to protect not only myself, but the integrity of my legacy. So the next morning, I called James Harris, the attorney who had helped me structure the Blake Living Trust years earlier, and I explained what had happened, not the personal humiliation, but the signs of entitlement. The credit inquiry, the potential misuse of my identity, the escalating disrespect that crossed into risk. And he listened with the steady calm of someone who had seen too many families collapse under the weight of entitlement and money. He agreed to review the estate update I had delayed for too long, and he suggested placing fraud alerts on my credit profile to ensure any further attempts by Jenna would trigger immediate notification. And as we discussed next steps, I realized that he did not hear the voice of a wounded mother. He heard the voice of a financial adult, someone who understood leverage protection and long-term planning. When I ended the call, I felt something I had not felt in months. Not anger, not sorrow, but agency. The quiet, firm kind that comes from rediscovering the full shape of your power. And for the first time since Jenna had spat those words not worth raising, I sensed a shift in the story because I was no longer the mother absorbing the blow. I was the woman preparing the ledger, and when that ledger balanced, it would change everything. I met James 2 days after the safe had reminded me who I truly was, and the morning light filtering through his office windows felt cold and clean, the kind of light that shows every truth whether you are ready for it or not. And he greeted me with the same steady professionalism he always had, pulling out a legal pad and asking gently, "What brought me in today?" And I took a long breath before explaining everything from Jenna's constant humiliation to the small ways she had chipped at my dignity to the moment she used my information for that credit application, and finally to her plan to control the so-called family college fund that she bragged about as if it already belonged to her. As I spoke, James scribbled notes quickly, occasionally lifting his eyes to study me with a quiet concern, not pity, but something closer to respect the kind people reserve for those who have endured too much without making noise about it. And when I finished, he leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen slowly, as if arranging every piece of my story into a structure. He said, "Nora, we need to update everything. The estate, the trust, the property agreements, all of it." And his voice carried a firmness that told me this was not optional, it was necessary. He outlined a structure I had once considered but postponed because I had hoped my family would behave like a family and not like a financial risk. And he explained it calmly, starting with the educational trust for Lily and Evan, a dedicated fund that would ensure their future, while locking Jenna out, completely removing her access to withdrawals, decisions, or influence. And as he described how the trust would require the children to reach maturity before accessing any funds, I felt a slow, protective warmth in my chest, because this was the first step in shielding them from the entitlement creeping through their household. Next came the lease agreement, the official document that would redefine everything about the house Michael and Jenna lived in, because while the deed had always been in my trust, I had allowed them to live there informally, and informality was a luxury I could no longer afford after seeing how easily Jenna assumed ownership of things she did not build, and James drafted a full lease with clear legal language, naming me as landlord and Michael and Jenna as tenants, subject to the same responsibilities as any renters in Columbus, including timely payment upkeep and behavioral clauses that reflected respect and non-harassment, something he said might be unusual, but absolutely permitted. He suggested including an option to buy after a set number of years if they could meet specific conditions, including a reasonable down payment, sustained responsible behavior, and a demonstrated pattern of financial stability, and I nodded, feeling that familiar accountant clarity rise inside me, the one that knows structure prevents disaster. When he asked how I wanted the terms adjusted, I did not hesitate, because the years of biting my tongue had burned away, and in their place stood a woman who had finally remembered her value. And I said that in the lease all previous favors needed to disappear, every discount, every exception, every unspoken privilege, and the rent should match the market rate, with no reductions, no deferred payments, and no expectation of repairs being handled at my expense unless legally obligated. James lifted his head, eyebrows raised, saying gently, "That is going to hurt them." And I answered quietly the way they talk to me already does, and for the first time, he did not try to soften the truth. He simply wrote it down because he understood that pain had shaped this moment, but logic would guide the next ones. He moved on to discussing the estate documents, reviewing how the current version left Michael as the primary beneficiary, something that had always made sense when Daniel was still alive, and the family felt whole. But now, under Jenna's influence, it posed real danger, and James explained that without changes, if something happened to me, Jenna could pressure Michael to sell everything, consolidate assets or funnel funds into their lifestyle rather than the children. And he paused before delivering the line that sealed my decision, saying, "Nora, you do realize that if anything happened to you today, Jenna would likely be the one pushing Michael to simplify the estate and sell everything. You are not just protecting yourself. You are protecting your grandchildren from a future family betrayal over money." And the words echoed through me with a cold clarity, because I had been thinking only of myself, the hurt, the disrespect, the humiliation. But James was right. This was much larger than pride. It was legacy. It was security. It was ensuring that Lily and Evan did not grow up believing manipulation was normal, or that money was a weapon used to control the quietest person in the room. And I felt something shift again inside me, a sense of responsibility that had slept for too long, awakening with purpose. We reviewed additional protections, fraud alerts on my credit reports, monitoring for unauthorized inquiries, passwords updated across financial accounts, and dual authentication for every login. And as James explained how each measure would create barriers Jenna could not cross, I felt the anxiety that had hovered like a thin fog begin to dissolve, replaced by grounded certainty. The meeting lasted nearly 2 hours, filled with clear strategy and careful planning, and by the end of it, a complete architecture of my financial world had been reshaped, not to hide from my family, but to protect what mattered from those who refused to value the person behind it. As I left the office, the air outside felt different, as if the world had tilted slightly back into alignment, and I knew that this was not revenge for humiliation. It was the beginning of accountability, the kind that aligns actions with consequence, the kind that makes a story shift from pain to power. And though Jenna did not know it yet, the home she flaunted as her domain was no longer the one she imagined, because the moment I signed those documents, the house stopped being the place where she held court and became once again part of the life I had built long before she ever walked into it. The morning we arrived at Michael and Jenna's house, the sun was only beginning to rise, the light still pale and soft across their quiet suburban street in Columbus. And I remember gripping the folder in my hands, feeling a steadiness that surprised even me, because for the first time in years, I was not walking into that house as the ignored mother or the convenient helper. I was walking in as the landlord, as the trustee, as the woman they had never taken the time to understand. And James walked beside me, calm and professional, carrying the documents that would end the fantasy Jenna had built around herself. When Michael opened the door, he looked confused, his hair still uncombed, his eyes puffy from sleep, and he stammered, "Mom, what are you doing here so early?" And I simply said, "We need to talk. Please get Jenna." And when he hesitated, James stepped forward, introducing himself in his firm, measured voice as the attorney handling the family estate. And I watched the shift in Michael's posture, the stiffening that comes when a person senses something larger than an ordinary conversation. Jenna finally came downstairs wearing the irritation of someone used to controlling the tone of every morning, and she frowned at James before looking at me with a cold impatience, asking what crisis justified waking her up at sunrise And the irony of her question did not escape me, since she never hesitated to drag me across town for trivial requests while mocking every hour of my time, yet now bristled at the idea of being inconvenienced for something that actually mattered. We sat at the kitchen table where I had so often cut fruit for the children and made coffee while she boasted to her friends. And this time James placed a thick set of papers onto the wood grain, spreading them out with careful precision. The lease agreement, the trust outline, the estate summary, each document representing a truth she had ignored for years, and he began speaking with the clarity of a man used to delivering facts, not negotiations. He explained first the structure of the trust and the legal ownership of the home, the one Jenna often referred to as her house, the one she decorated as if it were proof of her superiority. And as he spoke, Jenna's expression shifted from annoyance to confusion to something sharper. And when he finally said the property is held entirely in the Blake Living Trust, managed by Mrs. Blake and not owned by either of you, the color drained from her face so quickly, I almost wondered if she might faint. There was a long stretch of silence before she whispered, "So you could kick us out just like that." And the words trembled slightly at the end, in a way she could not hide, and I looked at her steadily, saying, "I could. I have not." And in that moment, the full weight of what she had risked became visible even to her, because she had spent years stepping on a branch she had never realized she was standing on, and now she was trying to find her balance with nothing solid beneath her feet. Michael sat frozen, his eyes flicking between the documents and my face, as though reading a language he suddenly realized he should have learned long ago. And James continued explaining the lease terms, the tenant responsibilities, the behavioral conditions, and then asked them both to review the documents so there would be no confusion moving forward. I let the silence settle for a moment before performing what might have been the smallest but sharpest revenge of the morning, because I looked at Michael and said gently, "Please read aloud the section on tenant responsibilities," and he blinked in surprise before obeying his voice, catching slightly as he read the legal requirements, upkeep payment deadlines, consequences for damages, the plain facts of adulthood laid bare in language he had avoided facing for years. Then I turned to Jenna, whose expression had hardened into a defensive scowl, and I slid a second page toward her, saying, "And please read this part." And she looked down and began reluctantly reading the clause, detailing the landlord's right to terminate the lease upon any form of harassment, disrespect, or abusive interactions with the landlord. And though her voice stayed even, her grip tightened on the paper, and the kitchen felt warmer, as if all the years of her condescension were now rising up around her in the form of consequences she had never imagined. It was not cruel. It was clear it was giving shape to boundaries I should have drawn long ago, and James simply nodded approvingly, as if watching a long-delayed correction finally take place. As they continued flipping through the documents, Jenna's eyes landed on the estate summary, a simple chart outlining my assets, and for a moment she looked puzzled before her gaze snapped sharply upward and she whispered, "You have over $2 million all this time." And the disbelief in her voice was almost comical, given how confidently she had dismissed me for years, as if my value could be measured in the price of my shoes or my car, or the absence of extravagant vacations. I held her stare and said quietly, "All this time, you thought you were talking down to a woman with nothing. You were talking down to the woman who could have made you homeless with a single signature." And the silence that followed was heavy, full of unspoken realizations, bending into shape around her like a slow, settling fog. Michael swallowed hard, as if realizing in that moment the cost of years spent looking away whenever Jenna mocked me, and I watched his shoulders sink with the weight of his passivity, while Jenna blinked rapidly, trying to stitch together a new version of events, one where she was not entirely at fault, but even she knew that this time there was no narrative she could twist, no comment she could dismiss, no room she could perform in, because numbers and deeds and signatures do not bend to arrogance. She sat back slowly, letting the truth seep in while James began explaining next steps, the timeline for signing the lease, the details of the trust that secured Lily and Evan's futures, and the protections that would ensure no one could ever misuse my identity again. And as he spoke, I observed Jenna, not with vengeance, but with clarity. Because for the first time, she was seeing me not as her built-in babysitter, not as her insignificant mother-in-law, but as the financial adult who had held up half their world without asking for credit and who now refused to be treated as less than she was. When we finished and prepared to leave the house, the sun had risen, fully casting warm gold across the kitchen floor, and the home they had once claimed so loudly now felt different, quieter, more honest, almost trembling under the weight of the truth that finally stood in it. And as I stepped outside, I felt no triumph, only steadiness, because this moment was not the revenge, it was the reveal, the first public exposure of what they never bothered to see, and the beginning of their long lesson in consequence. Walking into James' office a few days after the sunrise confrontation felt different from every other time I had stepped into that building, because instead of carrying the quiet ache of years spent being minimized, I carried a clarity that burned steady inside me, and when he ushered me into the chair across from his desk, the warm lamplight reflecting off the neat stacks of legal documents made me feel as though we were about to pull apart every loose thread Jenna had tugged on for years and finally stitch it into something solid, something mine. He asked gently what pushed this meeting forward, and I told him everything. The belittling, the credit inquiry, the humiliations presented as jokes, the way Jenna bragged about managing a future family college fund that she assumed she would control, and the repeated attempts to carve my role in this family down to something small enough to dismiss. And I felt his focus sharpen with each detail, because he had seen enough estate battles to understand that disrespect does not stay emotional forever. Sometimes it becomes financial. When I finished speaking, he leaned back, steepling his fingers as he always did when he was preparing to build something complicated yet necessary, and he said, "Nora, we are restructuring everything. We are going to build an estate architecture that protects you and protects your grandchildren and limits the access of anyone who might misuse your generosity." And the steadiness in his tone made my breath loosen, because for the first time in this story, I was not carrying the burden alone. He started with the educational trust, outlining how we could set aside funds specifically for Lily and Evan, with release conditions that ensured the money would belong only to them once they reached adulthood, funding college or training or whatever future they chose. And the important part, James emphasized, was that Jenna would have no authority, no access, no oversight, because the trust would be managed by a board-appointed trustee, someone neutral who could not be manipulated by guilt or tantrum or entitlement. And hearing this felt like placing a shield around the children, a silent promise that the toxic patterns I had endured would not be allowed to shape their futures. Then he moved to the house, the center of so many years of tension, the symbol Jenna clung to as proof of status. And he explained that while the deed resting inside the trust already secured my ownership, we needed a formal lease agreement, so there was no ambiguity, no assumed entitlement, no more blurred lines, and he drafted language naming me as the landlord with Michael and Jenna as tenants bound to all responsibilities that accompany adult living, including timely rent, full upkeep, repair obligations, and respect for the landlord spelled out plainly rather than hoped for. And I watched the paragraphs form like bricks building a foundation of accountability. He suggested including an option for them to buy the home after several years, provided they could meet strict requirements, a down payment proof of financial stability, and a verified pattern of respectful interaction, which made me pause, because the irony was sharp that decency toward me had now become a literal financial condition. And when I agreed to include it, he marked the clause with an approving nod. When he asked whether I wanted to keep the subtle family discounts in place, the lowered rent, the waived repairs, the unspoken allowances, I felt something tighten in my chest, the memory of Jenna mocking my tiny pension while I silently carried half their expenses, and I shook my head, telling him every discount needed to disappear because nothing about the way they treated me reflected gratitude or kindness. And he hesitated, saying softly, "That is going to hurt them." And I answered the way they talk to me already does, letting the truth hang between us long enough for it to reshape the air. He made the changes quickly and efficiently, crossing out each privilege they had treated as a right and replacing it with clear terms grounded in adult responsibility. And I felt a steady empowerment rise inside me with each revision. Because this was not spite, it was correction. It was me reclaiming every inch of ground I had surrendered over the years. When the lease and trust documents were nearly finalized, James shifted the conversation toward risk. Something I had suspected was coming, but had not fully prepared for, and he placed his pen down, saying, "Nora, you do realize that if something happened to you today, Jenna would likely be the one pushing Michael to simplify the estate and sell everything." And the bluntness of his words traveled through me with a cold precision, because for a moment I imagined exactly how she would handle it, calculating what could be liquidated quickly, how to turn assets into lifestyle upgrades, disguising greed as practicality. And I felt my hands clench in my lap as he continued saying, "You are not just protecting yourself. You are protecting your grandchildren from a future family betrayal over money." Hearing him say family betrayal out loud made the air feel heavier, because that phrase captured the core of everything that had been building inside me. The humiliation, the credit misused, the entitlement, all of it woven together into something deeper and more dangerous than I had wanted to admit. And in that moment, the full shape of my responsibility became clear, not just to defend myself, but to safeguard the two children I loved from financial manipulation disguised as parental decision-making. We discussed credit protections, next setting fraud alerts across all bureaus, creating a monitoring system that would notify me if anyone attempted to access or use my information again. And James helped me change passwords, lock down accounts, tighten digital security and design layers of verification that Jenna, without question, could never bypass. And the process felt like putting locks on every door that had once been left open, because I trusted people who had not earned that trust. When everything was complete, he slid the stack of documents toward me, asking if I was ready to sign, and I looked at the pages. The leases, the trust outlines, the estate changes, the protections, and instead of feeling overwhelmed, I felt aligned, as though the person sitting in that chair was the same woman who had once managed district budgets, uncovered financial discrepancies, and safeguarded millions with quiet competence, the woman my family never bothered to see. As I signed the last page, I realized something important. The humiliation at that birthday party had not broken me. It had repositioned me. It had turned my silence into strategy and my pain into structure. And as I placed the pen down, I understood that the house, where Jenna preened and bragged, was no longer her territory, not even in her imagination, because now the paperwork made it clear it never had been and never would be. And with that realization came a calm I had not felt in years, the kind that comes when the ground finally settles firmly beneath your feet, even as someone else begins to sense their own trembling. By the time the next morning arrived, I felt a steadiness inside me that I had not recognized in years, a quiet certainty that came from signing documents that finally reflected the truth of my position. And as the sun began to rise with its pale early light, I parked in front of Michael and Jenna's house, with James walking beside me, carrying the folder of finalized agreements and trust summaries. And for a moment, I stood there breathing in the cold Ohio air, letting the weight of what was about to happen settle comfortably on my shoulders, because this was not revenge, this was correction, and the house behind me was no longer a place where I would tolerate being spoken to as if I were insignificant. When Michael opened the door, he blinked in confusion, rubbing the sleep from his face, and his voice cracked slightly as he asked Mom what is going on. And before I could answer, James stepped forward, greeting him politely and introducing himself not as an attorney, but as the estate attorney for the Blake family, which made Michael stiffen and glance over his shoulder toward the stairs where Jenna was descending, with visible irritation wrapped around her like a robe. And she said sharply, "Why are we doing this before breakfast?" As if the inconvenience to her sleep schedule mattered more than the structure that had supported her lifestyle for years. We entered the kitchen where sunlight stretched across the table, illuminating the crumbs from yesterday's breakfast, and I sat in the same chair where I had spent countless mornings pouring juice for the kids, while Jenna scrolled on her phone and James set the documents down in a neat stack before clearing his throat with a professionalism that immediately shifted the room's energy as he said, "We are here to review updates to the estate structure and the property agreements." And the way Jenna's eyes narrowed told me she understood that for once, she was not the one holding the narrative. James began with the simplest truth, the one they had both lived inside without ever acknowledging, saying the property at this address is held entirely in the Blake Living Trust, of which Mrs. Blake is the trustee and therefore the legal owner. And I watched the words land on them like slow-falling stones because it took several seconds before Jenna processed what they meant. And when she finally did, her face went pale, her lips tightening as she whispered, "So you could kick us out just like that," and her voice wavered with a fear she tried to hide. I looked at her calmly, letting the pause speak before answering. "I could. I have not." And I watched the shock ripple across her expression, because for the first time in all the years she had dismissed me, she was confronted with the reality that her power had been an illusion, one she constructed on top of my silence. And once that silence ended, the foundation she stood on began to crack. Michael ran a hand through his hair, looking overwhelmed as James slid the lease agreement toward him, explaining this formalizes your tenancy with clear responsibilities and expectations. And he pointed to the sections we had discussed, the maintenance obligations, the market rate rent, the behavioral clause, and then he turned to me, asking gently if I wanted them to review the terms, and I nodded, feeling the quiet precision of a moment long overdue. I turned to Michael first, my voice steady as I asked him to read the tenant responsibilities aloud, and he hesitated, glancing at Jenna as though seeking permission before he began reading in a slow, uncertain voice, listing each requirement, the timely payments, the upkeep, the adherence to behavioral expectations. And as he spoke, I watched the reality settle on his shoulders, that adulthood no longer came with the safety net he took for granted. And for a fleeting moment, I almost felt sympathy until I remembered all the moments he watched Jenna belittle me and chose silence. Then I slid the second page toward Jenna, the one James and I agreed she should read, and I said, "Please read this clause." And she lifted the paper with stiff fingers, reading the landlord's right to terminate the lease upon any harassment or abusive behavior toward the landlord, and the words tasted bitter, even to her, because she knew exactly why that clause existed. And the room held a thick quiet as she reached the end of the sentence, the silence almost echoing with every insult she had thrown at me in that very kitchen. It was the smallest revenge, but the sharpest one, a mirror held up to her behavior, framed in legal language she could not argue with, and James nodded approvingly, his calm expression hiding the fact that he knew exactly how necessary this correction was. As they continued reviewing the paperwork, Jenna's eyes drifted to the estate summary, and for a moment she looked confused, scanning the columns until her expression froze and her voice came out thin, almost breathless as she said, "You have over $2 million all this time," and her disbelief felt almost comical given how confidently she had judged my worth based solely on what she saw on the surface. I met her stare with a calm that had taken years to cultivate, responding softly, "All this time you thought you were talking down to a woman with nothing. You were talking down to the woman who could have made you homeless with a single signature." And I watched the truth ripple through her. her eyes widening as she recalculated every conversation, every insult, every moment she told me to save my tiny pension for bingo. Michael exhaled sharply, as though realizing too late the cost of all the times he failed to defend me, and Jenna looked between us both, trying to assemble a story that made her less guilty, less exposed, but the documents in front of her left no room for spin, because numbers do not bend to ego, and legal ownership does not vanish, simply because someone refuses to acknowledge it. James continued explaining the trust for the children, the protections ensuring their future, the fraud alerts and updated structures preventing any misuse of my information. And as he spoke, I watched Jenna shrinking into her chair, not physically, but emotionally, collapsing under the weight of the reality she had never prepared for, because she had built her confidence on assumptions, and every assumption was now dissolving in front of her. When the meeting ended and James gathered the documents, the kitchen was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. And as I stood to leave, Jenna did not move, and Michael stared at the table as if seeing it for the first time. And I felt no triumph, only clarity, because this had never been about winning. It had been about truth, finally standing in the light in the same kitchen where humiliation once lived. And as I stepped outside, letting the morning air brush against my face, I felt something inside me settle into place, the steady, quiet power of a woman who finally stood up, not with shouting, but with structure, not with anger, but with truth. And that truth was enough to shift the ground beneath all of us. What happened next unfolded so quickly, yet felt stretched by the weight of years, because as Jenna sat frozen at the kitchen table, her face drained of color, and Michael stared at the documents as though they were written in a language he had never bothered to learn. I felt something inside me settle into a deeper steadiness, and I realized that this was the moment where silence would serve me no more, and clarity was the only thing left. So I rested my hands lightly on the edge of the table and said, "We are not finished," and the way both their heads snapped up told me they sensed that whatever came next was not going to be gentle. James remained standing beside me, calm and unreadable, as I pulled a single sheet from the folder, the page outlining the two possible paths forward, and I looked at them both before speaking clearly, because I wanted no room for misunderstanding, and I said, "I am giving you two choices, and both of them require something you have not offered me in years, which is basic respect." Michael swallowed hard while Jenna leaned back in her chair, her arms crossed tight as if bracing for impact, and I explained the first option, laying it out slowly, not for drama but for precision, saying, "If you want to stay in this home, you will stay as adults who pay for their lives. You will pay rent at market rate every month on time and in full. You will treat me with the same civility you expect from others. You will not mock my pension or my age or my presence. And you will not belittle me in front of the children or anyone else. And if those conditions are met, I will keep the educational trust for Lily and Evan intact and ensure they have the future they deserve." Michael nodded quickly, as though grasping at the lifeline, but Jenna's jaw tightened and she opened her mouth before I raised my hand and said, "I am not finished," and continued stating the condition that mattered most, which was that I would be invited into this family, not as a free service, but as a member, someone welcome at birthdays, holidays, and dinners, without being treated as an afterthought or an obligation. And if any form of toxic behavior occurs again, I will reevaluate the lease and the trust and make decisions accordingly. The kitchen grew impossibly still as I explained the second option, saying if you choose not to abide by those terms, you will have 90 days to move out. No drama, no legal battles, no screaming matches. I will not touch your credit or sabotage your finances, but you will leave this home. And aside from what is designated for the children, you will have no place in my estate. And Jenna let out a sharp, incredulous laugh, accusing me of manipulation and emotional blackmail. Her voice rising in a pitch that had always made Michael fold, but I simply stared at her until the sound strangled itself into silence, because she could sense I was not moved by theatrics anymore. Michael looked at me with a pleading softness, saying, "Mom, please, we can fix this. We can go back to how things were," and his voice cracked as he said it. And for a moment I saw the little boy he once was, the child who used to run into my arms after school and tell me everything. But that boy had grown into a man who allowed his wife to shred my dignity, and that longing to return to the past could not outweigh the truth of the present. So I shook my head slowly and said before last night, no one had ever told me I was not worth raising. There is no going back to that world. It is gone. And hearing those words spoken aloud seemed to hollow out the air between us. Jenna pushed back her chair angrily, muttering that I was trying to control them, that I wanted to punish her for being honest, that this was nothing more than a power trip. And I let her speak until she ran out of breath, because there was no need to argue with someone whose understanding of honesty meant humiliation. And when she finally fell quiet, I leaned forward slightly and said, "I am not punishing you. I am protecting myself and the children who should never learn that cruelty toward family is normal." She opened her mouth again, but before she could speak, I removed the final document from the folder, the updated estate directive not yet signed but fully drafted, and placed it gently on the table, and said, "There is something else you need to understand, because this house and this trust are not the only parts of my legacy. And since last night, I have made a decision I should have made long ago." Both of them stared at the page as though it might erupt, and I said, "I am updating my will. And instead of the majority of my estate going to Michael as originally planned, a significant portion will go to a fund dedicated to supporting older single mothers who want to return to school, because women like that are dismissed, overlooked, and undervalued. The same way I have been, and they deserve a chance to rebuild their lives the way I rebuilt mine." And the moment the words left my mouth, the shock on Jenna's face deepened into something like horror, because she understood that this was not anger, this was legacy reshaping itself in real time, and she had no place in it. Michael whispered, "Mom, you don't have to do this." But there was no conviction in his voice, only resignation, because he knew that this decision was not about spite. It was about justice and poetic balance, and the understanding that survival sometimes requires redirecting what you have built toward those who will honor it instead of those who take it for granted. I sat back, letting the truth settle over them. The truth that their choices carried consequences, now real, tangible ones. And the truth that I was no longer the quiet, accommodating mother who absorbed every cut with a lowered head and a soft smile. And as they stared at the papers in front of them, the outlines of their future shifting with every breath, I realized that this was the first time they had ever truly seen me, not as their support system or their convenience, but as a woman fully in control of her life, her resources and her boundaries. And for the first time, the fear on Jenna's face was not about money. It was about losing access to the person she thought she could mistreat without consequence. In the days after I laid out the two choices on their kitchen table, the house seemed to shift in the way people move around a wound tenderly and without confidence, and I could feel the tension even from a distance through the clipped messages Michael sent, and the silence Jenna clung to, as if silence might rewind what she had seen that morning. And it did not surprise me when the first attempt at retaliation came not in the form of apology or accountability, but in the form Jenna was most comfortable with: insinuation, whispered doubt, and a narrative she could shape to make herself the reasonable one and me the problem. She began by sowing seeds in Michael's mind, speaking in the low, urgent tone she used whenever she wanted him to believe she was protecting the family, telling him, "Your mother is unstable." Michael, "She is not thinking clearly, and she might be experiencing cognitive decline." And she repeated the phrase, "cognitive decline," with theatrical concern, as if she were diagnosing me from across the room and not spinning a convenient fiction. Michael hesitated because he wanted to believe the best of everyone, and that made him pliable in Jenna's hands. And I imagined the way she would press her fingers against her forehead, shaking her head just slightly as she said, "She is threatening to evict her own grandchildren, Michael. That is not normal behavior. You have to admit something is wrong." And the worst part was not that she said it, but that some small, frightened part of him might have believed her because he was desperate to reconcile the mother he knew with the boundaries he had never expected to face. Jenna pushed further, suggesting they should take me to a doctor to evaluate my mental state, adding that if a cognitive issue was confirmed, they could apply for power of attorney to protect the family, and hearing that from Michael on the phone as he stumbled through a half apology, half explanation made something cold settle deep in my chest. Not fear, not even anger, but a kind of exhausted familiarity because women of my generation had spent their whole lives being told that firm boundaries meant irrationality and that self-respect looked like instability when seen through the eyes of those who benefited from our silence. Instead of reacting, I scheduled my own appointment with a geriatric psychologist, someone recommended by a fellow board member who specialized in cognitive assessments for older adults. And the day of the appointment, I walked into the clinic with my head held high, not because I had something to prove, but because I refused to let Jenna weaponize my age or turn my agency into a weakness. And the assessment took nearly 2 hours, memory tests, language tasks, problem-solving exercises, and emotional screenings, all conducted gently and professionally by someone who treated me as a person, not a nuisance. When the doctor concluded and said, "Your cognitive health is excellent, Mrs. Blake. You have no impairments, no signs of decline, and no markers of instability," I asked for the written report, and he handed it to me, neatly printed, stamped and signed, the kind of documentation that speaks louder than accusations, and I slipped it into my bag, feeling a calm satisfaction settle inside me. I did not have to wait long for the opportunity to use it, because a few days later, I received an unexpected message from the school counselor asking if I could attend a meeting to discuss concerns Jenna had raised about family tension affecting the children. And I knew instantly what narrative she was preparing to spin. And rather than avoiding the confrontation, I arrived early carrying the sealed envelope in my purse. When Jenna walked into the small office with her performative sigh greeting the counselor with a grateful "thank you for doing this," she started her rehearsed line saying, "I'm worried about Nora. She's been forgetful and erratic, and I fear she may be losing it." And before she could finish, I placed the envelope gently on the table, sliding it toward the counselor, and said, "If anyone intends to use my name in a revenge story, money, or a false narrative of a crazy old woman, I prefer. They look at my official cognitive assessment first, and the room fell into a silence so sharp it almost hummed. Jenna's expression faltered, twisting through confusion, then disbelief, and finally embarrassment as the counselor opened the document, reading the clear clinical summary that directly contradicted her claims, and I watched her deflate in real time, the way a balloon loses shape once the air escapes. And what struck me was not triumph, but clarity. Because this was the kind of small truth that carries the weight of 1,000 unspoken corrections. But the real unraveling happened later, not in a small school office, but in the bright polished ballroom of the Foundation's annual gala, where I had been asked to attend as treasurer, and where Jenna arrived separately dressed in her best charity event attire, hoping to network with board members and position herself as a significant parent in the community. And she did not know I would be there because she never asked about my life beyond what could benefit her. I noticed her before she noticed me weaving through the tables with the practiced smile of someone eager to impress. And when her eyes finally landed on me, standing at the edge of the stage with other board members, her face tightened in startled recognition, because she could not reconcile the image of the woman she mocked with the woman invited onto a platform she never even knew existed. When the program began, the host spoke warmly about the Foundation's financial stewardship and the years of growth and impact, and then he gestured toward me, saying, "We would like to recognize the woman whose financial wisdom and emotional resilience has quietly changed thousands of lives, someone who has safeguarded our mission with unwavering integrity." Mrs. Nora Blake and I stepped forward into the warm wash of lights, while applause rolled through the room, soft and sincere. And I saw Jenna standing near the back, frozen, her mouth slightly open as if the air had been pulled from her lungs. It was not just that she had been wrong about my pension or my influence, it was that she had built her identity on a hierarchy she imagined, and suddenly that hierarchy had collapsed at her feet, because the woman she dismissed as irrelevant was the same woman who had signed off on grants for programs her own company had once applied to, and the look in her eyes held something raw, a realization not just of my financial power, but of my social reach, my network, my credibility, all of it far beyond anything she had ever guessed. In that moment, she was not seeing me, she was seeing every assumption she had ever made shatter one by one, and understanding that the story she told about who I was had never been rooted in truth, only in arrogance and convenience. And the shock of that truth rippled through her with a force she could not contain. And for the first time since I had known her, she had nothing to say. Several months passed after the gala, and the morning in their kitchen had carved new boundaries into the fabric of our relationship boundaries that neither Michael nor Jenna fully understood until life pressed against them, because when the interest rates climbed and Jenna's annual bonus shrank, and the comfortable cushion they relied on thinned faster than they anticipated the weight of market rate rent, and an overextended lifestyle began to squeeze the arrogance out of their daily routines inch by inch, until the certainty Jenna once carried started to look more like strain, and Michael's exhausted eyes in the brief moments we spoke told me the illusion of stability had cracked at last. They tried to adjust in the ways people do when forced into adulthood, late cutting back on dinners out, canceling unnecessary subscriptions, quietly shelving the expensive vacation they had bragged about for months. But the rent remained steady cold and indifferent to their discomfort, and the lifestyle Jenna curated like a stage set could no longer float on assumption alone. So it did not surprise me when one evening, just after sunset, I heard a knock on my apartment door, a soft, tentative rhythm I recognized immediately, because Jenna never knocked like that unless she wanted something. And when I opened the door, there she stood holding a small bakery box with a tight smile on her face, the kind of smile meant to look warm but strained under the effort. She stepped inside uninvited, placing the box on my counter, as though the gesture itself created intimacy, and she said in a carefully gentle tone, "We brought your favorite lemon cake." I baked it myself, which I doubted because she never baked. But the performance was familiar, the pretending, the sweetness, the attempt to soften the floor before she asked for what she came for. She took a slow breath, her eyes darting around my modest but peaceful living room, and said, "Nora, we are struggling and the kids are worried, and for the sake of the family we were hoping you might lower the rent, or maybe consider adding my name to the deed, so we have security." And hearing the word security fall from her lips with such practiced vulnerability made something inside me settle like a stone, resting exactly where it belonged, because it showed me clearly that she had not changed. She had only shifted tactics from mockery to manipulation. Instead of reacting, I let the silence stretch between us, allowing her discomfort to bloom because too often I had filled every quiet moment with reassurance and softened every harsh edge with understanding. And this time, I simply let her sit in the stillness she had earned, and when she finally looked at me with hopeful eyes waiting for me to fix her situation, I asked softly, was I worth raising yet, or still a wasted investment? And the question hit her with the precision I intended, because I saw her expression fracture the way pride collapses when faced with its own reflection. She tried to recover, stumbling over her words, insisting it was just a joke, just something said in the moment. but her voice wavered, and I lifted an eyebrow, asking gently, "Jokes usually need both people to laugh. I never did." And the truth hung between us, heavier than any rent bill, because she finally understood that her words had landed in a place she could not undo with charm or faux humility. Oh. She tried again, shifting tactics, reaching for sympathy, saying, "We are drowning, Nora, and the kids deserve stability, and this is their home." And I looked at her with a calm that came from months of rediscovering my strength, and said, "The kids do deserve stability, which is why your choices have consequences. But stability does not come from adding your name to something you did not build." Her face tightened with frustration as she realized the sweetness would not work, the flattery would not work. Nothing would work because, for the first time in her life with me, the door she wanted to walk through required accountability, and she had never brought that currency. So I told her clearly, "I am not lowering the rent, and I am not adding your name to anything," and the simplicity of the words seemed almost to knock the air from her lungs, because she blinked rapidly as though trying to hold back anger and disbelief, and I watched her stare at me, not as the harmless older woman she once dismissed, but as the owner of the home she lived in, the woman whose signature held her comfort in place, the woman she could no longer manipulate. As she grasped for another angle, mentioning the children again, I felt a shift inside me, the realization that this moment was not just about refusing her request, it was about protecting the future of Lily and Evan from being reshaped by the entitlement that had shaped their parents. And the thought came to me fully formed, cold and precise, a decision rooted not in revenge, but in responsibility. I said, "Jenna, there is something you should know because you keep speaking about the children's security and their future. And I want to be absolutely clear about the part of their future that is already protected." And she froze mid-breath, watching me with wary eyes, and I continued, "I am establishing an additional trust for Lily and Evan, one they will receive only after they turn 25, and it will be theirs alone, not yours or Michael's to touch." She tried to smile as if this were good news, but there was something in her expression that betrayed unease, because she sensed a condition waiting beneath the surface. And I let the pause linger before finishing. Not 1 cent of that trust can be used to pay your debts, or Michael's debts, or rescue either of you from consumer spending or lifestyle choices. They must be financially independent to access it, and the money is shielded from your influence, meaning there will be no borrowing from their future to fix the mistakes of your present. Jenna went very still, the kind of stillness that forms when a person realizes the long game has been rewritten without them, and I could almost see her calculating the implications. The loss of control, the loss of imagined access, the loss of a future she had assumed would always include tapping into what she called family resources, and I watched it land with full force. She whispered, "You are protecting them from us," and for the first time she was right, and I nodded, saying calmly, "I am protecting them from debt, from entitlement, from being dragged into financial messes they did not create, and from learning the toxic lessons you have tried to teach me for years, that respect is optional and generosity is owed." The room felt impossibly quiet as she absorbed this, and as she slowly stood gathering the untouched bakery box in her hands, I saw something flicker in her eyes. Not humility, not understanding, but the dawning recognition that the future she imagined, built on convenience access and assumed inheritance, was no longer hers to influence. And as she left my apartment without looking back, I felt the unmistakable sense that this moment would echo through every choice she made next, because she finally understood the truth she had spent years refusing to see, that I would protect my grandchildren even if it meant protecting them from their own parents. 6 months passed, then 9, and the seasons shifted in ways I could feel not only in the air, but in the small changes that appeared in Michael whenever he came by, because little by little the fog around him began to clear, and the version of my son who once sat silent while his wife humiliated me in front of a room full of people slowly gave way to a man who finally saw the truth he had tried so long to ignore. And it was not a single revelation that woke him, but an accumulation of quiet moments, a pattern he could no longer deny as Jenna's frustration with money tightened her tone with him, and her attention to the children became less about nurturing and more about keeping up appearances. And he saw finally that her marriage had always been a partnership of convenience, a financial alliance wrapped in the language of love, but hollowed over time by entitlement and performance. He did not tell me this in dramatic confession. He showed it in the small choices he made, choices that spoke with more honesty than words, because he began bringing Lily and Evan to see me without Jenna creating simple moments that felt more genuine than any birthday party crafted to impress others, and each visit deepened a quiet healing I had not dared hope for as he sat on my couch watching his children do homework while I cooked something small and warm. One evening, over a humble dinner of pasta and salad, a meal far from glamorous, but full of a softness I had missed, he looked around my apartment in a way he had not done in years and said, "This feels peaceful," and I knew the contrast struck him harder than he meant to express because the atmosphere he shared with Jenna was one of pressure and expectation, while here there was no performance, no need to pretend, and we sat eating in a shared silence that held more comfort than any expensive restaurant could give. In those months, I finalized everything with James, and we completed every update to the estate that I had envisioned. During the night, I opened the safe and remembered who I really was, and the poetic justice of those documents settling into place carried a satisfaction I did not feel guilty for. We shifted the bulk of the estate into the educational trust for Lily and Evan, protecting their future from the grasping hands of parents who had not yet learned how to separate responsibility from desire, and we crafted the conditions carefully ensuring that neither Jenna nor Michael could manipulate the funds, or borrow against them, or twist them into a lifeline for poor financial decisions. Watching the documents come together was like watching the shape of a better future, materialize one where my grandchildren would not be trapped in the same cycles of toxic family expectations that had defined Jenna's behavior. And yes, even some of the patterns I endured as a child myself. We dedicated another portion of the estate to the scholarship program for older women, returning to education, a cause that resonated with a part of me that had carried silent wounds for decades, because I had spent most of my life hearing people dismiss the ambitions of women my age, or the value of those who raised children, or those who worked behind the scenes. It felt right that my money would help women reclaim their stories, build financial footing, and find the quiet justice I had learned to claim for myself. I added another small portion toward micro-grants and workshops, teaching financial literacy and emotional resilience to women facing hidden family betrayal, because I knew too well what it meant to be overlooked, underestimated, and taken advantage of, and I wanted other women to learn earlier than I did that their dignity was not something to barter for acceptance. Through all of this, Michael continued coming by with the children, sometimes helping with chores, sometimes bringing ingredients so we could cook together, and sometimes simply talking about his day without the tension that used to weigh every word. One night, after the dishes were nearly done, he stood at my sink, rinsing plates while I dried them, and the soft sound of the television drifted from the living room, where Lily and Evan lay sprawled on the carpet, giggling at something silly. And for a moment, it felt like a life I could have had if the years had unfolded differently. Slow, honest, peaceful. He paused, then turned toward me with a look I had not seen since he was young, a mix of curiosity, regret, and searching, and he asked quietly, "Mom, do you ever regret not telling us sooner who you really were?" And the question held layers he did not say out loud, asking if I regretted the years I allowed myself to be small, to keep the peace, to maintain a family shape that was already cracked. I took a breath, feeling the weight of his question, and everything that had led us here, the years of silence, the humiliations, the revelations, the healing, and I answered softly, I regret not telling myself sooner that I never had to earn basic respect by paying for it, and the truth of that sentence softened something in him and in me, because it acknowledged not only my growth, but his, and the space between us that had once been filled with unspoken pain, now held understanding. When he finished the dishes, he hugged me a slow, steady embrace, not rushed, not obligatory, and in that quiet connection, I felt the closing of a circle, not perfect, not flawless, but whole, enough for the next chapter. Later that night, after they left and my apartment settled back into stillness, I stepped onto my balcony where the evening breeze carried the smell of early autumn, and below me the neighborhood lights flickered like small promises of peace, and I realized that the life I had built now was not the life anyone had given me. It was the life I had chosen, one protected by boundaries, shaped by truth, and sustained by dignity. And if someone watching this has lived through their own quiet storms, their own hidden betrayals, their own moments of being told they were not worth raising, I hope you hear this clearly. Your worth is never measured in what you paid for others or in how much you endured in silence. Sometimes the strongest form of silent revenge is choosing dignity over money and standing up for yourself without hatred. Sometimes quiet justice is simply telling the truth to yourself first. If you want more stories like this where people reclaim respect and find truth and closure without becoming what hurt them, share your own story below or tell me where you are watching from. Your voice matters.